Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Surviving the Big Quit, Maintaining Business Continuity and Reducing Key Person Dependency Risk. I'm Megan Sosman, Marketing Manager here at Dataprise, and I'm going to go over a couple of items before we get into the good stuff. So today's webinar is going to run about 45 minutes, and it is being recorded, and the recording and the materials will be sent to you post-event. We ask that you submit any questions that you may have at any time throughout the webinar in the questions panel, and we will address them at the conclusion of the webinar. Now, a little bit about Dataprise real quick in case you don't know us. Dataprise is the leading strategic IT solutions provider to IT leaders who believe technology should allow you to be the best at what you do. On the right-hand side, you'll see some of the industry-leading solutions we deliver. Not surprisingly, cybersecurity is at the top of the list as we lead with a cyber-first mentality when delivering solutions to our clients. We then layer on the additional components to support your organization, from fully managed IT to standalone support services. We have you covered. And joining us today is Risk Cooperative, a minority-owned insurance brokerage and risk advisory firm licensed to originate, place, and service innovative risk management and insurance solutions. They operate across a wide range of industries, helping organizations gain access to global markets and the tools to solve intractable business challenges through strategy, risk mitigation, and supplier diversity. So let me introduce you to today's speakers. On the Dataprise side, we have JP Ruiz. JP is the risk compliance subject matter expert here at Dataprise, as well as virtual chief information officer to our enterprise clients. And from Risk Cooperative, we have Andres Franzetti, CEO and co-founder. He oversees the firm's overall operations and strategy and brings a wide range of experience and specialization in helping multinational organizations address complex risks. Thank you both for joining us today.
Yes, thank you.
So before I pass things off to JP and Andres, I'm just going to give a quick overview of today's agenda. So we're going to start with defining key person dependency risk and putting its implications into perspective. Then we'll cover knowledge documentation and risk management planning, as well as cross-training and succession planning, followed by insider threats and the new NSA and CISA assessment tools. We'll address how HR and IT work together to reduce risk. And then we'll discuss the relationship between these risk controls and cyber insurance policies and premiums. Finally, we will provide more insight into how to best offload and mitigate key person dependency risk in your organization, followed by the Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton to JP to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Megan. So everybody, we're here to talk about key person dependency risk, the risk surrounding what happens when an organization is relying on one or a few individuals to do certain things. Now, while Dataprise is certainly an IT shop, it's an MSP, key person dependency is actually within any department. Could be somebody who has specialized knowledge, somebody whose specific proven skill is necessary for continued business operations. It could be within any department, really. I mean, head of HR, somebody in your operations team. Really key people can be anybody. It doesn't necessarily have to be somebody in the leadership team. And so whenever you in your organization know that there's a go-to person for the questions that arise or an escalation or a big issue, that's usually going to be some of the key people we're talking about. So what happens when you have these key people in your organization, you're relying on them to some extent, and you're facing with in an environment like what we are currently going through with this big quit, this Great Resignation. There's a lot of turnover in most organizations and in most industries, and we are seeing a great number of organizations having to revisit their business continuity planning and their disaster recovery planning as a result. When organizations don't take the proper steps to manage this risk or document this risk or understand, who their key personnel are, when they're faced with turnover, there's a lot of changing costs and a lot of planning that needs to go into what do we do next? How do we quickly hire somebody? What knowledge was lost when the person left the organization? And so on today's webinar, we're talking about a lot of the newer, more prominent techniques that organizations like yours do to try to mitigate some of this risk, or to transfer this risk in some manner, or to eliminate it outright. So moving on. So putting it into perspective, right? So even at Dataprise, we see many different companies coming to us for assistance on the IT side, where an IT leader or their IT team has since left the organization, and the organization is faced with, well, we don't even know what we have anymore. All of our guys have left. What do we do to even assess our environment, to plan around, what we have access to, what do we need to shore up, what backups do we need to consider, right? But in general, just since 2021, we've had over 47 million people voluntarily leave their jobs, right? So again, I think this isn't a surprise to anybody that's on today's call. Turnover is particularly large right now. And so amongst leadership, right, that has turned over, 32% of the companies that had CEO departures, for example, underperformed the rest of the market by more than 20%, significant underperformance, right? So there certainly is a very big impact to losing your key people. There's a financial impact, there's often a reputational impact, an ability to meet your compliance obligations, your obligations that are contractual to your clients. So we're trying to mitigate that with some of these strategies. So
Yeah,
Andreas, what do you see on your side for what's driving this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and a lot of the comments that you mentioned, JP, are spot on, right? And what we've seen with clients and some of the statistics that you just showed, it's really industry agnostic, right? I think the pandemic and the last couple of years have really forced folks to reevaluate both, what they're doing personally as well as work and the type of environment that they want to work in. So we've seen that some of these are the driving reasons for resignations, from just reevaluating work-life balance to feeling overworked or just really a lack of recognition or happiness within the firms that they're in. But we're also seeing, and we're seeing this again across all industries, not just what many folks assume is the frontline positions, retail, hospitality, food service industry. It really has been across the board. And we've already seen some industry segments, for example, IT, cybersecurity, where we've already had a lack of qualified professionals. There's a talent gap in those segments. And this has only helped to exacerbate that. And we've seen a lot of folks not just, resign and go into a different career or a different role. They're really looking at this as a way to reposition their own positions and to either get a raise in title, raise in salary. And so we've seen a lot of that, and it becomes really not just about identifying where the key folks are within your organization, but also around a recruitment and retention strategy, especially for government contracting or other realms where there's a finite talent pool already. And we've seen quite a bit of that with our clients in the last couple of years, and it will likely be a trend to continue. I think if we move to the next slide here.
So certainly, so now that we've discussed, the fact that there is a problem and that this is a very significant risk across all the organizations we've been working with, and certainly yours as well. What do we do, right? So the first step, or the easiest solution that we have seen on the technical side is going to be documenting this knowledge, this tacit critical knowledge, right? And so what is it? What do we mean by that tacit critical knowledge? It's basically that knowledge that's essential and hyper specific to your organization, right? It's the accumulated know-how that's often in people's heads and is not necessarily written down. So if you are in retail, some of the retail laws or some of the clients or vendors that you do business with, depending on the location that you're working out of, that all that knowledge, if somebody leaves the organization and they're the only person who has that knowledge and it's not written down, you have some significant catching up that needs to be done. So what do we do in terms of documenting, right? So there are certainly a number of solutions out there, software solutions, for example, that allow you and your organization to document all of this tacit critical knowledge in, for example, a knowledge base, right? So it is a central repository that people can have access to that lists out all of this critical knowledge. Could be by department, could be by business process. There are multiple ways in which you can provide this to your employees. The top two are going to be an internal wiki, that we see a lot of. So most people are pretty familiar with Wikipedia or wikis in general. So they're usually easy to create and they're easy to customize and give access to business unit leaders within your organization to go ahead and add in their team's SOPs, their policies, procedures, and any of the contacts that they use to do their business. Anything that, again, is considered tacit critical knowledge. Additionally, we also see intranets, right? A company's intranet is often used for this purpose, right? Sometimes organizations think that the intranet is just a place to put, company events or an employee portal or HR, but in fact, lately we're seeing an abundance of organizations move from the intranet being just for that purpose to a repository for this type of information, right? And so there are a number of software solutions out there, Freshdesk, Zendesk, Confluence, HubSpot. All of these are just some examples of ticketing systems or knowledge-based software that you can use to go ahead and start documenting some of this information. And right, so SOPs are a very good first step in terms of documentation within the knowledge base. Standard operating procedures. Each of your business units, what do they do? How do they do their job, right? If the IT team were to turn over, right, is there an IT guide for dummies for the next guy who comes in and says, all right, I can look at this manual and I know exactly what systems are available, what processes are in place, what our network looks like, what our infrastructure looks like, the whole 9 yards. Same thing with HR. What does our hiring process look like? What does our orientation process look like? Who do we use for onboarding? All of that standard operating procedure manuals should be the first things that you put into these knowledge bases. Again, if the person that is a key person were to leave tomorrow, what does the next person need to be able to hit the ground running, right? And so that's the mentality that an organization has to have when they're trying to decide what do we document, right? And so all of this, right, all of this is informed by risk assessments as well. So when you're conducting a risk assessment, when we're talking about risk assessments, what do we mean? We mean all the financial, reputational, organizational, productivity losses that can occur if some event is realized, right? And certainly a key person leaving is a major, event that could realize certain risks. So when you're planning, you're doing your risk assessment and you're trying to understand what are the critical business processes, what are the types of data that we have that's sensitive and critical, what information do we need to constantly have to provide these critical services, especially some of our members in today's webinar that are in the healthcare space, for example, continued operations of their healthcare facilities. Conducting a risk assessment helps outline those priority targets, right? Those priority people, that's priority knowledge. So certainly risk assessments are something you want to consider and something that is going to help you determine what to document, right? And so obviously all of this goes without saying is all part of business continuity, right? So any of the disaster recovery planning that you do as an organization, any of the business continuity planning that you're creating obviously has a key person component to it or should have a key person component to it, but all of that documentation should also be placed into said knowledge base. So if somebody leaves and there is a major risk event or a critical event, so the next person to come in knows exactly what controls are in place, what backups, who do we contact, alternate site locations and what have you, so your organization isn't as interrupted.
I think additionally to that, and I think this is something that has happened, especially again, the last couple of years. It's really about building up redundancies and building up your succession planning. I think all the protocols that JP and then the tools that JP just mentioned are critical, and they have to be implemented, and then they have to be utilized and held accountable, right? So I think in many cases, what we've seen is the last couple of years have really caught, in some cases, clients off guard. The definition of key person and what roles were typically identified as the critical roles of the organization tended to skew perhaps a bit more towards the senior executives or roles that weren't necessarily in the day-to-day. And when we had large numbers of folks resigning or shifting positions, it really created a sense of vulnerabilities and gaps that weren't previously identified. So what we see here in terms of some action items that can be implemented by organizations, it's really to identify key positions. And this may be going beyond your traditional definition of key positions. It will look at what is being done day to day, who holds more senior positions or seniority within the firm that knows the historical data of the firm that might not be documented. It's looking at the capabilities of the organization, and it's taking internal stock of what capabilities can be handled internally, what capabilities are currently being outsourced. Key person can also be defined as a provider or a vendor, and you got to identify what vulnerabilities can be, realized as a result of those types of relationships being disrupted. And then the question comes into play of, okay, well, how do you start building up capacity? How do you start building up redundancy? How do you start creating that cross-training capability and that succession planning? And that's where organizations can go out and identify interested employees or implement cross-training and shadowing programs that help to facilitate knowledge transfer, in addition to writing down and implementing policies and procedures and document sharing and storage. All of that helps to reinforce, but having individual employees that you can start building out career paths and start shadowing critical roles and functions, start identifying and diversifying your supplier network so that you have more redundancies built in. All of those are components that are really going to help organizations build up their resiliency and their redundancy in an event of a critical role or person leaving the organization. And this is something that has to be evaluated, and the effectiveness of it has to really be measured on an ongoing basis. A lot of times, and I'm sure JP sees this a lot as well, data recovery plans or any types of policies and documents are developed, they're stored on a shared drive, but then they're not revisited. And they're intended to be updated annually, but they're not done so. Or key positions shift in an organization, and we don't necessarily backfill them, or we don't reassign or update roles as they evolve. All of these things have to be taken into consideration with an expanded and more agile lens, so your organization can really keep pace with the evolving landscape that we're operating in today.
Quick question, Andres, actually, just going back to that slide. So something that we've seen when it comes to succession planning or cross-training, right? Oftentimes our key people, that knowledge that they've obtained is something that they've obtained over years of experience, right? It makes them critical to the business, and it provides that type of value, and they know their own worth, right? So how do we manage, on a human side, right, the idea of them losing their status as a key person if they're cross-training or they're documenting all of their knowledge, right? We've certainly seen that when we have, certain IT personnel that are the SMEs, subject matter experts of a specific software, and they're being asked to teach a bunch of people that software. How do we manage that fear?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's a very real concern for organizations, really of all sizes, right? I think everybody gets into that area where you create little fiefdoms within the organization, and that can be, it's great to have that level of ownership and investment in the organization, but it can also be a dangerous precedent when you're trying to have, when somebody leaves and takes that knowledge with them. I think, we view it from the perspective of risk management and risk mitigation, and it's about reducing the impact and the disruption as much as possible. You're never going to get to, zero entirely and be able to totally eliminate it, but I think there are ways that you can help to reduce that impact. On the information side of it, it's again, we're having policies documented, we're having these procedures and documents uploaded to shared drives, intranets, all of these components, and leveraging tools and resources helps to, at the very minimum, capture the foundational data and the information so that you have the framework and the bulk of the information there. the institutional knowledge and the individual legacy knowledge that comes with it. Cross-training and shadowing can help capture some of that, but you're going to always lose a little bit of that and have some attrition with folks that are leaving. But there are ways also to help facilitate more of that sharing from the human perspective. And that's where, as we saw in the opening slide, some of the key drivers of the Great Resignation that we're seeing right now is, the cultural aspect of an organization. And the more that the leadership from the top down can really facilitate that information sharing, that cross-training, that knowledge sharing, and prop those individuals up as kind of pillars of the company where they can hold their own town halls, they can really share their knowledge. It helps to validate that feeling of that they're critical of the organization and provide that additional safeguard that they're not being replaced or on their way out. So it is a mixed bag there, and you have to do a little bit of both. But if you take those two approaches, you can help contain some of the potential attritional knowledge loss.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And to that point, especially if they're being built up as pillars within the organization, cross-training also allows them additional bandwidth to be freed up to do the things that they might want to do, right, within the organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so excellent point. All right, let's move on. So we're not the only ones that are looking at this, guys. NSA, CISA, right? So these are government organizations, government departments that have been looking at security and thinking about risk, obviously for, within the governmental administration as well as government contracts. But all of their tools are, public, and they're used by, they can be used by any organization, regardless of industry. And so they actually have recently, this past year, published a number of tools to target specifically insider threat. And so what is insider threat? And why is that something we're talking about when we're talking about key person dependency, right? So insider threat is any risk, right, originating within the organization, so it's an employee, right, and it's intentionally or unintentionally activated in some manner. It could be everything from somebody who's a disgruntled employee taking client lists, or institutional knowledge that's proprietary and running with it, right, into the next company. That could be somebody accidentally clicking on a phishing email and providing, authentication credentials and unintentionally giving access to whatever it is that they have access to, right, as a key person. So any kind of authorized access that is used to do harm, whether it's intentional, unintentional, that's what we talk about when we talk about insider threat. And so it's a very real risk that we see very often in my line of work, right? In terms of IT, in terms of data, right, and data governance. And when you're looking at key people and trying to identify key people and the key information, the insider threat is inherently attached to that because we want to make sure that we're accounting for these key people and the insider threat that they might pose if they were to, say, worst case scenario, become a disgruntled employee, or they accidentally click on one of those phishing links and their credentials are compromised, right? And we're talking about, think of the head of IT, right? Your CIOs of your organizations, right? What happens if they lose all of their credentials and all of that access is available? So CISA actually pushed out an insider risk mitigation program evaluation assessment instrument. I know it's a mouthful. It's free, it's on their website. And it goes through what insider risk looks like, who are the people that are most at risk for being an insider threat, how do you document this? How do you plan for this? How do you further secure their accounts, further secure their job roles from exposure to that type of risk? What type of assessments do you do? Who's within these assessment committees, right? It's pretty comprehensive. And again, it's free. Highly recommend taking a look at that when you're doing this key person dependency risk analysis, because it helps characterize your definition of what a key person is and what key data and information within your organization is that tacit critical knowledge that you may want to either cross-train to another department or other users or document in some kind of knowledge base. So we talked a little bit about the people side of this, right? Insider threat, how do you make sure that key people still feel like key people once they've cross-trained out some of their knowledge? Certainly, IT and HR have a lot of crossover here, right? And so how do we as an organization, leverage our IT teams and IT software and our HR departments together to try to mitigate some of this risk, right? And so one that we see often is the onboarding and offboarding process, right? So when somebody is being onboarded, right, and they're being provided access to this information, do we provide access entirely to somebody who's just starting in the organization to all of the most critical knowledge that we have access to? Again, think of, for example, the secret recipe for KFC, right? And all of those herbs and spices. Do we, the first person who jumps in a leadership role, do we give them access to that recipe? Or do they have to take some time and become, invested in the company, become a vested interest before they have access to some of that more, sensitive knowledge, right? And so that's something that you should consider. We've certainly seen examples where somebody would join an organization with the sole purpose of harvesting some of this data only to jump ship, a couple of weeks later, right? So understanding what that sensitive data is and attributing access to sensitive data to a job role specifically, we always recommend doing a minimum necessary rule, right? And so all of my HIPAA and healthcare people on the call today are probably very familiar with this, as well as my legal folks. But the minimum necessary rule, just provide the knowledge that is minimally necessary for them to do their role, right? And so as their role evolves, as their responsibilities evolve, then you provide additional access. Now the offboarding is arguably even more important than this, right? And so this is where HR and IT specifically has to get involved. So say that you're offboarding somebody and you know that they are a key person, and your IT team says, all right, we'll just revoke access, within Active Directory or whatnot. We just turn off their account. That should be enough, right? Well, unfortunately, we're in a day and age where most organizations use a lot of SaaS, software as a solution services. And oftentimes these all have their own unique usernames, passwords, and access in some manner, right? So how do you know what access a person who is in your organization actually has in the entire tenure of their career at that organization? If I was at, Dataprise, for example, for 10 years, maybe it's not enough that my account is just disabled. Maybe I have access to a bunch of other applications, a bunch of other solutions, third-party software, websites. How do we track that? And how do we make sure that IT it has a full comprehensive checklist of what to revoke access from, right? And so there are a number of software tools that are available that allow this, right? So probably the one that's going to be the easiest and most people are familiar with is going to be SharePoint, right? So SharePoint is an example of, a customizable platform in which you can create an employee action form, something that all employees or managers have to use to make any employee action within the company in terms of user provisioning, job role change, onboarding, offboarding, the whole 9 yards. Somebody wants to go ahead and hire somebody within their team. There's a standardized form in SharePoint. They specify what type of access they need. Now that person gets hired. We know what access they have. We gave them the right access within IT. Now the person's job changes a year later. They need access to something else. You go to the same form. So now during the offboarding process, 10 years later, all the IT team has to do is look up, Andres's username or whatnot, and you have a list of all the employee actions that were ever taken on his account. We know all the access that was ever given to him, all the access that was ever revoked, and we have a comprehensive checklist of what exactly to pull to revoke access. So we make sure that even if he leaves the organization, he doesn't still have backdoor access to some of our sensitive data, right? So again, access control. When you're onboarding people, make sure that they have role-based access, right? Make sure your key people that in key positions have what they need to do the job, sure, but only what they need to do the job and not anything more, right? We also don't want to give the keys to the kingdom to everybody in the organization and make everybody a key person because, well, then that's a data governance issue at that point. But again, that minimum necessary rule, right? And lots of software tools out there, not even just SharePoint, lots of ticketing systems. Actually, those ticketing systems I mentioned earlier, the knowledge-based systems like Freshdesk, ServiceNow, all of those actually have the capability to create this onboarding, offboarding standardized process so that IT is aware of these key people. And if they do actually leave, they mitigate some of that insider threat and risk of compromised access.
That's great, JP. And I think, what I like is that this is a different view of key person risk than is normally contemplated by companies. And it's correct, because it's sort of where it's evolved to, right? It's not just identifying who's critical for business from a income perspective or revenue perspective, it's who's critical to the company that can cause a disruption. And we're seeing now that there's more requirement for these types of controls and processes in place, not just from compliance, but also from insurers, and especially around areas like cyber, which is becoming an increasingly complex issue for all companies, especially middle market companies. We've seen that attacks are on the increase, up 93%. Everybody's familiar with ransomware, and those attacks continue to rise. And a lot of the time, these are really occurring because of those types of issues, right? Folks that have access to data that are not, or security protocols that are not being followed, and policies that are not being implemented. And what's resulting is we're seeing that insurance companies are now increasing premiums for organizations exponentially on this front as well. And as we'll see in the next slide here, the controls are also being required from an underwriting perspective. We can see that having these types of policies, having the types of software and applications that you mentioned, having the type of offboarding interviews and access controls, those are the requirements that insurers are mandating in order to be able to even be eligible for lines of insurance like cyber. But this relates across the realm, right? It's for liability policies, for employee liability policies. Cyber just happens to be one of the most visible right now. But those, again, protocols and looking at key person risk from a broadened perspective, and looking at all the various implications that it can have on the organization, are really where organizations need to start looking and adjusting to. As we continue on. So again, and JP, you can chime in here as well, but just, looking at the offloading, I'm sorry, I think we can go back to the previous slide, looking at, the redefined key person dependency and key person risk, you can start seeing that, again, it goes not just within the organization, it's really looking at your suppliers, your vendors, both from the perspective of who are the critical vendors and suppliers that you're relying on in order to be able to execute and meet business objectives, as well as, what are the protocols and safety procedures that you're requiring of them if they have access to your networks. For example, with data, they can be another critical source of risk. So it really is looking at it from that full perspective. And we'll talk about key person insurance here in the next slide. But that's another way of mitigating risk, right? It's another way of looking at insulating the company from more of the financial perspective. Insurance is really a way to transfer the financial risk. But we'll see even there's ways to expand upon the traditional key person insurance policies. And JP, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I know this is a very important content slide as well.
No. I mean, I completely agree with everything that you're saying. I think something that we should consider, and talking about offloading, mitigating key person risk here, when you identify your key roles within your organization, and again, that could be a single person or it could be a team. How do you, if you don't have the opportunity to cross-train, right? Another opportunity that most organizations do have access to is outsourcing, right? And so, I mean, certainly one of the benefits of outsourcing a department or a single role, I mean, there's multiple, right? So one, you now have the redundancy you're looking for. If one person within the outsourced company leaves, the rest of the company fills that in, right? Additionally, you have access to probably a wider skill set than a single person might offer. I know, for example, some of my clients in the past, have had a single Salesforce resource, right? And so they recognize that their entire department or organization runs on Salesforce, and there's a huge demand for constant Salesforce customization and work. Well, if that person leaves, what happens, right? And so sometimes they actually outsource it to a Salesforce development company that's constantly keeping up to date with Salesforce development. Obviously, from Dataprise, we're an MSP. We offer this service as well to IT organizations or organizations with IT teams, where we kind of fill in for the IT team, right? Instead of there being one person, 2 engineers, we have 350, right? Or service desk. But the idea, though, is that you free up your internal resources. Maybe they can do something that's more in line with what they want to do, but it provides that redundancy that you're looking for when you're talking about trying to mitigate that key person risk. And certainly, like you mentioned, Andres, key person insurance, which I think is, what you're about to talk about, it's a way of transferring that risk.
Absolutely. And we can go into a bit more detail on the next slide here on key person insurance. Traditionally, key person insurance has been a vehicle to help a business withstand sort of the financial implications of losing a key person. For key person insurance, it typically looks at life or disability, and it's typically looked at more for executives or kind of owners of companies, but it can help keep the business afloat, and it's a very important coverage for organizations to consider. It does provide that financial compensation that can make up for lost revenue. It can keep staff and the business going as you're adjusting to new owners and shareholders. But it is something that also needs to be expanded upon, right? The impact that loss of a key person can have can be severe, but as we just highlighted in the last slide, and if we go to the next one here, we can look at what we would call key person insurance 2.0. Right, and there's a whole set of new insurance policies that can help mitigate key person dependency risk as much as key person insurance can help with the loss of a key executive. Policies like cyber, for example, bring in a lot of additional resources, whether it's for breach response, whether it's for business interruption in the midst of a ransomware attack, whether it's liability protections, but it does bring in these additional components, and you can bring in MSPs like Dataprise to help bring the organization back online. It's more of a break in the case of emergency scenario than it is if you prepare policies and cross-training and those types of proactive measures. But it's a great way for companies to insulate themselves financially from these losses. And when you don't have the capability of hiring outsourced providers, cyber insurance and policies like it that bring these additional embedded resources can be a way to help augment the company's capabilities at a fixed lower cost as well. So that's another key area where I think companies need to start looking at and broadening, again, that definition of what key person dependency and what the risks that they entail are.
Absolutely. So final thoughts. So for everybody that's on the call, we talked about a lot of different strategies, but where do you start, right? What is the first step to doing all of it, to thinking about a knowledge base, to thinking about cross-training, succession planning, who your key people are, right? So I like to, when I talk with my clients as a CIO, I like to use the VRIN framework for identifying the types of data within your organization that you should be looking at, which informs everything that we've talked about, right? That's V, valuable, right? What within your organization is a source of some form of value to the organization, right? In terms of relative cost, benefits, and what is it valuable in terms of similar resources that a competing organization might offer. Second, the R is rare. What is within your organization in terms of data, what is scarce relative to the demand for its use or what it produces, right? What's rare knowledge? And again, it could be the go-to guy who knows Salesforce, right? And maybe nobody else in your organization has Salesforce knowledge. What's inimitable, which is unable to be imitated by others, something that you can't just quickly learn with a YouTube video in an afternoon and some coffee. And what is non-substitutable, right? The N, which is that other resources in your organization cannot really be functional substitutes. So if you're able to identify that type of data, the VRIN data, right, within your organization, then everything else kind of comes into play, right? That data is the data that goes into the knowledge base articles. The people who have access to that data are the insider risk threat stuff that we talked about, that the NSA and CISA are producing tools to help you guys manage. The people who have access to that and are the arbiters of that knowledge are the key people we're talking about here, right? If you're looking at insurance, that's the type of data you want to secure. That's the type of data you want cyber insurance for. Those key people are the people you want key person insurance, right? Those are the people that you want to cross-train. Those are the people that you want to have some form of succession planning in your disaster recovery and business continuity, right? And then those are the people that you want to elevate, right? You want to empower, and you want to allow them to have their own teams and provide, input and value into your organization by maybe allowing them to pick, who they're cross-training or who they're, doing their succession planning with. But all of these risks really involve this data. And so that would be the first step. Identify that data, identify those key people, and then look at all the tools and resources that are out there in the industry that allows you to, create onboarding and offboarding processes or create intranets or internal wikis to support that. Andres?
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think the only thing I would add to that is when you're doing that type of analysis, the other part that can help is because it's challenging, right? And we know that this is a big thing to take on, especially for smaller organizations, and sometimes it's hard to quantify or to think through, what is the effect of this. So there's ways of carrying out, when you have that VRI analysis done, there's ways of also applying the business impact analysis to it. And it doesn't have to be as daunting as it sounds. For large organizations, that may be a lot more quantification and analysis, but ultimately, if you start identifying where that data or where that business function lies, then you can look at the impact analysis of it, and you can assign either a business revenue function to it, and then start rating and seeing where the impact is and where the capability of the organization to withstand it is as well. If it's going to be a severe impact or a lower impact, and that's how you can start prioritizing some of that data and some of these redundancies and building out the policies. And that's where also insurance, again, comes into play as a mitigation strategy. If it's a severe impact and the company can't withstand it or you can't hire for it, then insurance in some cases can help. But those are kind of the processes to get started with this. It's really, I think, as JP mentioned, that VRI analysis, looking at what data, what processes, and what business functions are critical, and then the impact of losses or disruptions to them. And it's really, looking at it from a very broad lens. I think we have to, redefine what we mean by key person. It should be more key relationship or key people dependencies, and that can be internal or external to the organization.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the bringing a business impact analysis into the equation. Understanding, the financial, reputational, regulatory, safety, health risks, anything involving some form of an outage or a loss could certainly not just help you, like you mentioned, help you identify, but it also helps you budget, right? If you understand, that there is a set financial loss for a single risk event, right? And that risk event is surrounding a specific person, then you know how to budget accordingly to create a redundancy. Whether it's, if it's a significant enough loss, you just hire a second person, or, you have backup repositories for your data or what have you.
Absolutely. And so if there's any questions that, we can help answer, we're happy to field any questions from the participants. I think, JP, we have one question here. Maybe, I don't know if you want to take the first stab at it, and happy to chime in on it as well.
Sure.
The question is, so a key person is leaving the next week, within the next week, and we haven't established all of your recommendations. What's our best use of time over the 2-week notification period? It's a good question.
It's a great question. So say that you don't have an internal wiki, you don't have succession planning, there hasn't been any cross-training, and somebody leaves tomorrow, or they express their intent to leave. So for a lot of our larger clients, and this is certainly something that you should do even as a small organization, the first thing that you do is for those 2 weeks, you shadow. You have somebody that's set specifically to shadow that person in their meetings, in their projects. There's a specific individual that's dedicated to shadow that person, that key person, right? The second thing is you have to have your IT team immediately start harvesting that data from their laptops, from their OneDrive, from whatever that person uses for their day-to-day, right? And start organizing that data, not just for the department, but for whoever's going to assume their role after their departure in the organization. And I would say the last thing that I would consider, besides all the access control stuff that I mentioned earlier, right, making sure that you document what type of access, but I would say that it's documentation of all that knowledge as much as possible, right? So you have, I know that at least at Dataprise, whenever we have somebody that's going to leave, we spend those 2 weeks documenting all of their research, their work, all of the projects they're working on, and incorporating that into our internal knowledge base, because we have internal knowledge bases as well. Andres, yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's the main part is, having somebody shadow them. I think it's, conducting an audit of, now that you know sort of what the protocols should be to build that redundancy, you can use that as a way to benchmark an audit. And wherever there's gaps, you can have that person that's shadowing have a bit more of an agenda of jotting down processes, role, responsibilities, getting access to emails and functions and duplicating all that, as you mentioned, is critical as well. I think, a more qualitative element, which I think a lot of companies tend to have that knee-jerk reaction of somebody says I quit, especially folks that are perhaps in a bit more client-facing or sales role, and there's that knee-jerk reaction to say, okay, well, let's shut them down, restrict access, and get them out the door as quickly as possible to save business. And that can be, while you have to protect the business interests, I think that sometimes that can be a bit of a counterintuitive move, right? Because you're going to lose some of that institutional knowledge. So I think implementing the access and technological protocols to protect the company, but at the same time working with them and creating sort of that transfer of knowledge is going to be critical.
Completely agree. I see we have another question came in. So do these strategies change between smaller and larger companies? Yeah. So for smaller organizations, certainly your key people, most of the people in your organization is going to be key persons to some extent, right? Depending on how small your organization is. I would say that, yeah, for our smaller organizations that are on the call, so everything that we talked about is really like mid to enterprise strategies, certainly. Mm-hmm. It's pretty easy to see how you can, as a larger organization, develop an internal wiki, to develop, cross-training plans, to develop or create mentorship coaching programs or what have you to try to do some of the transmission of that knowledge. But for our smaller organizations, it's really going to come down to documentation then. Since you can't really cross-train and everybody has a specialized role, for all of my small company clients, they certainly rely on an intranet or an internal wiki or some kind of knowledge base to protect and create that redundancy. It's much more difficult to have cross-training when you only have 30, 50, 100, users in your organization. It's still possible, right? On the one hand, because it's a smaller company, there's that more relational aspect where you can actually have, a better one-on-ones with your coach or mentor for that cross-training purpose. But I would say that for smaller companies, I would rely a little bit more on the software tools available to do documentation, for sure.
Yeah, and I would add, I think an area where, especially in smaller entities that have multiple owners, if you have a partnership agreement and these types of things in place, an area that often goes overlooked, and it's really where key person insurance, for example, was intended to come into play, is if you have one of the owners that passes away. Then you have a scenario where the business financial stability comes into question, and if they're not able to buy out the new shareholders or relatives of the firm, that's when you want to look at buy-sell agreements. You want to look at key person insurance and start contemplating those types of succession planning discussions and exit packages, so that it can help avoid any potential issues of the firm facing liquidity issues or financial continuity issues in the event of that type of scenario.
Completely agree. Looks like we have one other question. Yeah, so this one's, what are some examples of knowledge-based software that Dataprise has used in the past? So I mentioned a couple of those on the call earlier. So we actually use internally, we're actually shifting over to ServiceNow, which is another knowledge-based and ticketing system. But we've certainly worked with clients that have used Freshdesk, Zendesk, Confluence, HubSpot, of course, SharePoint. People use SharePoint a lot for their internal knowledge base. I know that we've used Genesis was another one. We use a lot, right? And so there's a lot of options out there. Really, when you're looking at different solutions, first you want to identify what type of strategy do you want to go with. Do you want to do an internal wiki, a knowledge base, or an intranet? Those are really the top three that we usually see. And there's software for each of those. So for the internal wiki, actually for all of our Microsoft and Office 365 clients and people who are on the call, you can actually use OneNote. So OneNote actually has the ability to be a relatively, because you guys are already paying for it, free solution for the development of an internal wiki. with links and access rights and control and whatnot, where all your teams have access to it. Certainly there are, Document 360 has a couple of recommendations. They're somebody I use all the time for software recommendations for this type of work. But yeah, and then if you're going to go with intranet, well, that's just comes down to, internet development, web page development. And there's certainly a lot of solutions that are out there for that. But really, when it comes to knowledge base, which is the one that we see the most common of the three, those are some examples that, and they're relatively intuitive to set up, honestly. We help a lot of our clients set them up, but if you have an internal IT team, I would highly suggest, after this call, you go talk to your IT team. Hey, we heard this webinar. We really want to establish a knowledge base. There's a lot of resources out there, and to tell them to look into things like Zendesk or ServiceNow or Freshdesk. Those are going to be some of the more popular ones that allow you to take that institutional knowledge and document it someplace. Any other questions? Great. I think that's it. Well, thank you everybody so much for coming to our little talk. Hopefully, if there is any appetite for identifying, your critical or your key people and what have you, you've taken away a couple of strategies from today's presentation. Certainly, my organization and Risk Cooperative are always here to assist in our relative spheres. Certainly on Dataprise's side, we are here not just as an outsource IT provider, but we certainly help with the strategies involved in, trying to mitigate some of the key person risk that you have on the technology side. And same thing with Risk Cooperative, Andres.
Yep, likewise. We're here to help. Happy to discuss any of the insurance needs of working with through the risk management sort of approaches and mitigation strategies, and working closely with JP and Dataprise, on that front as well. So thank you, and really look forward, enjoyed the webinar very much.